Sweat dripped down a desperate father's face as he stared at the crisp, certified check resting on the mahogany desk. $1 million, enough to save his daughter's life, erase his crushing debts, and rewrite his shattered future. All he'd had to do was surrender his dignity to a ruthless billionaire CEO for a single night. But the words that left his mouth next didn't just shatter her cynical worldview. They unlocked a devastating secret that would alter both of their destinies forever. Aelius Bell adjusted the collar of his stiff, starched uniform, the abrasive fabric scraping against his tired neck. The brass name tag pinned to his left breast pocket caught the dim light of the employee locker room, reflecting a man who looked a decade older than his 32 years. Dark circles, carved by chronic exhaustion and perpetual fear, framed his hollow eyes. Outside, the brutal Chicago winter howled against the reinforced glass of the Langham Hotel, whipping off Lake Michigan in vicious, icy sheets. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Aelius was about to begin his third consecutive double shift. He closed his locker, his gaze lingering on a small, crinkled photograph taped to the metal door. It was a picture of a little girl with missing front teeth and unruly auburn curls, bundled in a pink winter coat. Candice, his 7-year-old daughter, the center of his universe, and the source of a terror so profound it threatened to suffocate him daily. Candice had been diagnosed with severe cystic fibrosis 3 years ago, just months before Aelius's wife, Sarah, was killed in a hit-and-run on Lower Wacker Drive. Since then, Aelius's life had devolved into a frantic, terrifying race against time and debt. The medical bills from Lurie Children's Hospital were an avalanche that had already buried his savings, his 401k, and the modest life insurance payout he had received. Every month required thousands of dollars out of pocket for specialized nebulizers, pancreatic enzymes, and vest airway clearance therapies. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor in Rogers Park who watched Candice during his night shifts. "She's coughing again, Aelius. It sounds wet. Giving her the treatment now. Stay safe." Aelius gripped the edge of the metal bench, closing his eyes as a wave of nausea washed over him. The eviction notice sitting on his kitchen counter flashed in his mind. He had exactly 14 days to produce $4,200 for back rent, or they would be out on the street. A homeless shelter was a death sentence for a child with compromised lungs. He needed a miracle, but Aelius had long ago stopped believing in those. He pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped into the sprawling, opulent lobby of the Langham. The contrast between his reality and his surroundings was always a cruel joke. Here, the air smelled of imported white tea and fresh orchids. The floors were a flawless expanse of imported Italian marble. Guests drifted past him draped in Armani and carrying Hermes Birkin bags that cost more than Aelius made in 3 years. "Bell," a sharp voice snapped. It was his manager, Mr. Harrison, a perpetually red-faced man who treated the hotel's wealthy clientele like minor deities. "The Moore party is occupying the entire top-floor penthouse. The CEO just arrived from a gala at the Field Museum. She requested absolute discretion and a fresh pot of Blue Mountain coffee delivered every 2 hours. Do not speak to her unless spoken to. Do not look her in the eye, understood?" "Yes, sir," Aelius replied, his voice a flat, practiced monotone. Vida Moore was a legend in the corporate world, though most of the stories painted her as a monster. At 36, she was the sole founder and CEO of Moore Omnicorp, a tech conglomerate that had effectively monopolized the global logistics software market. She was famously dubbed the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley before moving her headquarters to a towering skyscraper in downtown Chicago. She fired executives in elevators. She dismantled rival companies with surgical precision. She was a billionaire several times over, an untouchable elite who viewed human beings as either assets or liabilities. Aelius prepared the silver coffee service, his mind miles away, calculating whether he could sell his rusted 2008 Honda Civic and rely entirely on the CTA trains. It would get him perhaps $1,500. Still not enough. As he wheeled the mahogany cart toward the private VIP elevator, his foot caught on something small and hard on the thick Persian rug near the grand piano. He stopped, looking down. Half hidden in the intricate pattern of the carpet lay a piece of jewelry. Aelius knelt, his breath catching in his throat as he picked it up. It was a custom Cartier diamond collar necklace. Even to his untrained eye, the sheer size and clarity of the stones were staggering. It was heavy, cold, and practically radiated wealth. To the right person in the diamond district on Wabash Avenue, this piece could easily be fenced for $500,000. Unmarked. Untraceable. Aelius's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. Take it, a dark, desperate voice whispered in his mind. Take it, walk out the back door and never look back. Candice's hospital bills would be gone. The rent would be paid. You could move to Arizona, where the dry air would help her lungs. You could save her. His fingers tightened around the cold diamonds. He thought of the eviction notice. He thought of Candice's wet, terrifying cough. He imagined the feeling of not having to choose between groceries and electricity. But then he thought of Sarah. He remembered the promise he had made to his dying wife in her hospital bed. Raise her right, Aelius. Raise her to be good, even when the world isn't. Aelius exhaled a shaky breath, the fantasy dissolving into the harsh reality of who he fundamentally was. He couldn't build his daughter's survival on a foundation of theft. He stood up, placed the necklace on the silver tray next to the porcelain coffee cups, and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse. The penthouse doors slid open to reveal a living space that rivaled a modern art museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the Chicago skyline, the John Hancock Center piercing the low-hanging winter clouds. Vida Moore stood by the glass, a glass of Macallan 25 in her hand. She was striking in a terrifying, absolute way. She wore a midnight blue velvet evening gown that clung to her sharp, statuesque frame. Her dark hair was pinned up flawlessly, but her eyes, a startling, icy pale blue, were what demanded attention. They were the eyes of a predator who had long ago run out of worthy prey. "Leave it on the table," Vida commanded without turning around. Her voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with a boredom that bordered on contempt. Aelius wheeled the cart silently to the center of the room. He carefully transferred the coffee pot and cups to the glass table. Then he picked up the Cartier necklace. "Ma'am," Aelius said quietly. Vida sighed, a sharp sound of irritation, and finally turned. "I believe your manager instructed you not to speak to me, Mr. She glanced at his chest. "Bell." "I apologize, Ms. Moore. I found this in the lower lobby near the piano. I believe it belongs to you." Aelius held out the necklace. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Vida's meticulously guarded face. She slowly walked over, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked at the necklace, then up at Aelius's face. She didn't take it immediately. Instead, she studied him, dissecting his frayed collar, the exhaustion in his eyes, the cheap, scuffed orthopedic shoes on his feet. "Do you know what that is, Aelius?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "I know it's expensive, ma'am. It's worth $1.2 million, she stated bluntly. "It is a bespoke piece. And you are a night manager at a hotel, making what, $18 an hour?" "21, ma'am," Aelius corrected softly. "Why didn't you steal it?" The question was asked with such clinical detachment, it threw Aelius off balance. "Excuse me?" "Don't play coy," Vida snapped, taking a step closer. The scent of her expensive perfume, something sharp and floral, washed over him. I read people for a living, Aelius. I buy and sell entire corporations before breakfast. You are exhausted. You are poor. You are desperate. I can see the panic humming just beneath your skin. You could have walked out of this building, fenced this for a fraction of its cost, and changed your miserable life. So why didn't you? Aelius placed the necklace on the table. Because it isn't mine. Have a good evening, Ms. Moore. He turned to leave, but her voice cracked like a whip. Stop! Aelius froze. Vida walked around him, circling him like a shark. Her mind, perpetually calculating, was spinning. Vida Moore did not believe in altruism. She believed that every human being on the planet had a price. Her own father had abandoned her and her mother for a $2 million buyout from a rival tech firm when she was just a teenager, teaching her the only lesson she ever needed. Loyalty, morality, and love were just commodities waiting for the right bid. She had spent her entire adult life proving that theory correct. She had bought off politicians, ruined the uncorruptible morals of whistleblowers with fat checks, and watched the most self-righteous men crawl when presented with enough zeros. But this man, this broken, exhausted nobody in a cheap uniform, had just handed her back over $1 million out of some pathetic, antiquated sense of duty. It infuriated her. It challenged the very foundation of her worldview. I am currently facing a massive public relations crisis, Vida said suddenly, pacing in front of the windows. A former executive is writing a tell-all book claiming I am a sociopath who destroys people for sport. The board is nervous. They want me to soften my image. They want a human interest angle. Aelius stood perfectly still, unsure why a billionaire was monologuing her corporate problems to him. I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. Don't be. It's a game. But your little display of Boy Scout morality just gave me an idea. Vida stopped and looked directly at him, her pale eyes blazing with a sudden, dark intensity. You need money, Aelius. Don't bother denying it. The way you look at this room, the way your shoulders slump, you're drowning. Aelius's jaw tightened. My financial situation is none of your concern. I am making it my concern. Vida walked over to a sleek mahogany desk in the corner. She pulled out a checkbook and a fountain pen. The scratching of the nib against the heavy paper was the only sound in the room. She tore the check out and walked back to him, holding it between two perfectly manicured fingers. $1 million, Vida said, her voice dropping to a hypnotic purr. Tax-free. Yours to keep. It clears in the morning. Aelius stared at the piece of paper, his heart stopping. $1 million. The eviction notice evaporated. The panic of hospital bills vanished. He saw a house in the suburbs. He saw Candice running in a backyard, breathing easy, smiling. He felt his knees go weak. Why? Aelius choked out, his voice barely a whisper. What is it for? Vida's lips curved into a cold, cruel smile. For one night. I want to buy your dignity, Aelius. I want you to spend the next 12 hours in this penthouse. You will be my absolute subordinate. You will do whatever I ask, whenever I ask, without hesitation or question. You will fetch, you will kneel, you will entertain me, and you will debase yourself for my amusement. She stepped closer, invading his personal space. I want to watch the precise moment you realize that your precious morals are just a luxury you can't afford. I want to prove to myself that a man as supposedly good as you is just as hollow as the rest of the world when the price is right. Take the money, Aelius. Sell me your soul for the night. Aelius stared at the check. The zeros blurred in front of his eyes. He thought of Candice's wet cough. He thought of the terrifying, suffocating grip of poverty. All he had to do was swallow his pride. Just 12 hours of humiliation. What did his dignity matter if it saved his daughter's life? He reached out, His fingers brushed the thick paper of the check. Vida's smile widened into a triumphant smirk. She had won. She always won. But as Aelius's fingers touched the paper, a memory flashed violently in his mind. He was sitting on the edge of Candice's hospital bed after her last major lung infection. She had looked up at him, her small hand gripping his finger, and whispered, "I'm not scared, Daddy, because you're the bravest man in the whole world. You always do the right thing." Aelius slowly pulled his hand back, leaving the check suspended in Vida's grip. The silence in the penthouse was sudden and deafening. Vida frowned, her triumphant smirk faltering slightly. "Take it. You know you want it. You know you need it." Aelius took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. The oppressive exhaustion that had weighed him down for years seemed to momentarily lift, replaced by a fierce, unshakable clarity. "You're right," Aelius said, his voice steady and resonant, completely devoid of the servile tone he had used earlier. "I am drowning. I have a 7-year-old daughter named Candice. She has cystic fibrosis. Every breath she takes is a battle. We are 2 weeks away from being evicted, and I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night in 2 years because I am terrified she will stop breathing while I close my eyes." Vida blinked, caught off guard by the raw, unvarnished honesty. "Then take the money, you fool!" "I can't," Aelius replied, looking directly into her icy blue eyes without flinching. "Why not? Are you really so attached to your pride that you would let your child suffer? That makes you a terrible father, not a martyr." Vida spat, genuine anger beginning to boil beneath her surface. She needed him to take it. She needed the world to make sense according to her rules. "It's not about pride, Ms. Moore," Aelius said softly. "It's about the foundation I am building for my daughter. If I take this money, if I sell my dignity to be your plaything for a night just to prove your cynical worldview correct, the man who walks out of this penthouse tomorrow morning won't be the father she knows." He stepped closer to her, his presence suddenly immense, filling the massive room. "Candice doesn't just need medicine. She needs a father she can look in the eye. She needs to know that no matter how dark the world gets, no matter how desperate things seem, there are lines we do not cross. If I sell my soul to you tonight, I am teaching her that we are nothing more than property to be bought by people like you. I would rather work my hands to the bone for the rest of my life than bring tainted money into her home. So keep your $1 million. My daughter's hero is not for sale." Vida stood paralyzed. The check in her hand suddenly felt heavy, absurd, and entirely useless. For the first time in 20 years, she had no counter-argument. She had expected anger. She had expected greed. She had expected him to negotiate for more. She had not expected absolute, unshakable integrity. "You're an idiot," she whispered, though the venom she tried to inject into the words failed, leaving her voice sounding hollow and shaken. "Maybe," Aelius said. He turned and walked back to the service cart, completely dismissing the billionaire. He picked up his empty tray. "Enjoy your coffee, Ms. Moore. If you need anything else, please call the front desk. My shift is over." Aelius walked out of the penthouse, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a soft click. He stepped into the elevator, his hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading. He had just walked away from $1 million. He had walked away from Candice's cure. A tear leaked from the corner of his eye, tracing a hot path down his cheek. Had he done the right thing? Had his morality just condemned his daughter? The doubt gnawed at him, but deep in his chest, his soul felt fiercely, undeniably clean. Back in the penthouse, Vida Moore remained frozen in the center of the room. The check fluttered from her fingers, landing on the Persian rug next to the Cartier necklace. Her mind was reeling. "My daughter's hero is not for sale." The words echoed in her head, piercing through the armor she had spent a lifetime building. She thought of her own father, who had sold out his family, his company, and his daughter for a check not much larger than the one on the floor. Her father had looked her in the eye and told her it was just business. Aelius Bell had just looked poverty, eviction, and his child's illness in the face, and chosen honor over a buyout. Vida walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the tiny, ant-like cars navigating the icy Chicago streets. For the first time in her life, Vida Moore felt something she had never experienced before. She felt poor. Suddenly, she spun around, marching toward the mahogany desk. She picked up her sleek platinum smartphone and dialed her chief of security. "Yes, Ms. Moore." The gruff voice answered on the first ring. "I need a complete dossier on a man named Aelius Bell," Vida ordered, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't name. "He works at the Langham. I want to know everything. His debts, his background, his medical records for a daughter named Candice. I want it on my desk in 1 hour." "Understood. Are we pursuing a hostile action, ma'am?" Vida looked down at the voided $1 million check on the rug. "No," she whispered. "We're pursuing something entirely different." The game had completely changed, and for the first time, the Ice Queen realized she wasn't the one making the rules. The sun had not yet risen over Lake Michigan, casting the Chicago skyline in bruised shades of purple and slate. Inside the penthouse of the Langham, Vida Moore sat perfectly still in a velvet armchair, a thick manila folder resting on her lap. It was 4:15 a.m. Her chief of security, David Miller, stood silently by the door. David was a former intelligence operative who rarely asked questions and never delivered incomplete work. He had compiled the dossier on Aelius Bell in less than an hour, pulling from hospital databases, credit bureaus, and sealed police records. Vida opened the file. She had expected a sob story, perhaps some poor financial decisions, or a gambling habit that had driven the hotel worker into poverty. She was accustomed to the self-inflicted wounds of the desperate. What she found instead was a tragic, immaculate record of a man who had done everything right, only to be systematically crushed by the universe. She read the medical reports first. Candice Bell, age 7, severe cystic fibrosis. The itemized bills from Lurie Children's Hospital were staggering. In 3 years, Aelius had accrued over $400,000 in medical debt. He had sold a modest 2-bedroom home in Oak Park, liquidated a retirement fund, and maxed out a dozen credit cards just to afford his daughter's daily medications. The eviction notice, filed 3 days ago, was neatly printed on page 4. Then she turned to page 5. It was a redacted police report from the Chicago Police Department, dated November 14, 2023. Incident: fatal hit and run. Victim: Sarah Bell, age 29. Location: Lower Wacker Drive, eastbound. Time approximately 11:30 p.m. Details: victim's vehicle was struck on the driver's side by a high-speed SUV, moving in excess of 80 mph. The offending vehicle did not stop. Forensics recovered trace amounts of custom obsidian black automotive paint. Case remains open. Leads exhausted. Vida stared at the date. November 14, 2023. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside washed over her. Her photographic memory, the very asset that had made her a billionaire, snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. November 14, 2023, was the night of the Moore Omnicorp annual shareholder gala at the Palmer House Hilton. It was a mandatory event for the executive board. She remembered the evening vividly because her chief operating officer at the time, William Tressel, had arrived nearly an hour late, visibly sweating and disheveled. "Minor accident, Vida," William had smoothly lied, handing his coat to the concierge. "My driver hit a deer on the way in from the suburbs. The Bentley is a total loss. But we're fine." A custom obsidian black Bentley Bentayga, Lower Wacker Drive was a subterranean roadway entirely encased in concrete. There were no deer on Lower Wacker. Vida's hands began to tremble. William Tressel was no longer just her COO. He was now a rogue board member, the very man who was currently trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of her company. Tressel was the one quietly funding the PR smear campaign against her, the one feeding lies to the press about her being a sociopath. He was a ruthless, ambitious shark who had spent the last 3 years trying to dethrone her. And 3 years ago, he had murdered Aelius Bell's wife. Vida closed the file, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She realized instantly what Tressel had done. He had used Moore Omnicorp's immense resources to pay off the right detectives, scrub the traffic cameras on Lower Wacker, and make the damaged Bentley disappear. He had buried his crime using the very corporate machine Vida had built. "David," Vida said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Yes, Ms. Moore?" The obsidian black Bentley that William Tressel reported totaled in November 2023. "I want you to find out exactly where the wreck was taken. I want the salvage yard, the crushing records, the NDAs signed by the mechanics. I want it all." David raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "I'll need to dig into the company's off-the-books expense accounts to trace the bribes." "Do it!" Vida commanded, standing up and walking to the window. The city below was beginning to wake up, the streets filling with the invisible working class, people like Aelius, carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders while the elite played God with their lives. Aelius had refused her $1 million because he believed in justice, in right and wrong, in setting an example for a daughter who was fighting for every breath. He had made Vida feel small and empty. But now, staring out at the skyline, she didn't feel empty anymore. A fierce, unfamiliar fire ignited in her chest. She was going to give Aelius Bell his miracle, and she was going to use him to absolutely obliterate William Tressel. The L train rattled violently as it crossed the river, the screech of metal on metal grinding against Aelius's exhausted eardrums. He stared at his reflection in the smudged window. He looked like a ghost. He had spent the entire ride back to Rogers Park agonizing over the check he had left on the penthouse rug. $1 million. He could almost feel the phantom weight of it in his hands. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the eviction notice. He saw the empty refrigerator. But then he remembered the cold, predatory look in Vida Moore's eyes when she offered to buy his dignity, and his stomach turned. "I did the right thing," he repeated to himself like a mantra. "I did the right thing." When he finally climbed the creaking wooden stairs to his apartment building, it was past 7 a.m. He unlocked the door to Unit 4B. The apartment was freezing. The radiator was acting up again. Mrs. Gable, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, was asleep on the faded floral sofa. In the corner of the small living room, hooked up to a humming oxygen concentrator, was Candice. She was sleeping peacefully, though her breathing was shallow and slightly labored. Aelius's heart broke, as it did every single morning, at the sight of her. He gently shook Mrs. Gable awake, thanked her, and handed over the last $20 bill in his wallet. After she left, he sat on the edge of Candice's bed, brushing a stray auburn curl from her forehead. "I'm sorry, baby," he whispered into the quiet room. "I'm so sorry." At 9:30 a.m., a sharp knock at the door startled Aelius from a light doze at the kitchen table. He stiffened. The landlord. It was 3 days until the end of the month. He was coming to serve the final papers. Aelius braced himself, mentally preparing a plea for just 1 more week, and opened the door. It wasn't the landlord. It was a man in a crisp, tailored suit holding a sleek leather briefcase and a thick, sealed envelope. "Aelius Bell?" the man asked. "Yes? My name is Jonathan Hayes. I'm a senior partner at Hayes & Croft, representing a private philanthropic trust," the man said, offering a polite smile. "May I come in?" Confused and wary, Aelius stepped aside. The lawyer walked into the cramped apartment, his expensive shoes tapping against the cheap linoleum. He didn't seem to notice the peeling paint or the chill in the air. "Mr. Bell, I am here on behalf of an anonymous benefactor," Jonathan began, opening his briefcase on the kitchen counter. "Effective at 8 a.m. this morning, all of your outstanding medical debt at Lurie Children's Hospital has been paid in full." Aelius stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "Excuse me? Paid? All of it?" "Yes, sir. Over $400,000, Jonathan confirmed, handing Aelius a stack of legally binding, notarized receipts. Furthermore, the trust has secured a place for Candice in the new Vertex Pharmaceuticals gene therapy trial. The costs of the treatment, the in-home nursing care, and the specialized equipment have been funded in perpetuity. Aelius's knees buckled. He gripped the edge of the counter, staring at the papers in his hands. The stamped red letters screaming, "Paid in full," blurred as tears immediately flooded his vision. It was impossible. It was a dream. Who did this?" Aelius choked out, his voice cracking. "I can't accept this. If this is from who I think it is—" "The donor is strictly anonymous, Mr. Bell," the lawyer interrupted smoothly. "And before you refuse, you should know that the trust is established entirely in your daughter's name. It is legally hers. You are merely the guardian of the account. To reject it would be to reject her medical care." It was a brilliant, inescapable trap. The benefactor knew Aelius would never accept charity for himself, but he could never refuse it for Candice. Before Aelius could process the magnitude of the miracle, the lawyer pulled a second folder from his briefcase. "There is one more matter," Jonathan said, his tone shifting from philanthropic to deadly serious. "My firm specializes in wrongful death litigation. Our benefactor has retained us, pro bono, to reopen the investigation into the death of your wife, Sarah Bell." Aelius's head snapped up. The shock of the medical debt vanished, replaced by a sudden, protective anger. "The police said all leads were exhausted. The cameras were supposedly broken. It's been 3 years. Why now?" Jonathan pushed the folder across the counter. "Because the police were bribed, Mr. Bell. The man who killed your wife is a very powerful corporate executive. He used his company's resources to cover up the accident. But our benefactor has acquired the salvage yard records, the hush money wire transfers, and a sworn affidavit from the mechanic who crushed the vehicle." Aelius opened the folder with shaking hands. He stared at a photograph of a heavily damaged black Bentley, the driver's side completely caved in. Underneath it was a profile of a man named William Tressel. "We are filing a massive civil suit tomorrow morning, and we have already handed the evidence over to the district attorney for criminal charges," Jonathan explained. "But our benefactor wanted you to know the truth first." Aelius's mind spun frantically. The debt cleared, the trial drug secured, the man who killed his wife finally exposed. There was only one person in the world with the power, the resources, and the motive to orchestrate all of this overnight. Vida Moore. "Where is she?" Aelius demanded, dropping the file. "I don't know who you are referring to, sir," Jonathan replied, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He snapped his briefcase shut. "I will be in touch tomorrow regarding the lawsuit. Have a wonderful day, Mr. Bell." As the lawyer left, Aelius stood frozen in his kitchen. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 3 years was gone, replaced by a dizzying sense of awe and suspicion. Vida Moore had offered him $1 million to humiliate him. He had refused. In return, she had given him back his life, entirely anonymously. He had to see her. Aelius threw on his coat, kissed Candice's forehead, and sprinted out the door. He took the L train back downtown, his heart pounding in his throat. When he reached the Langham, he bypassed the employee entrance and marched straight to the front desk in the grand lobby. "I need to speak to the guest in the penthouse," Aelius told the concierge, breathing heavily. Vida Moore. The concierge looked up, recognizing him despite his street clothes. Aelius, you're not on shift. And Ms. Moore checked out an hour ago. Her security team cleared the floor. Aelius's stomach dropped. She's gone? She did leave this for you, however, the concierge said, reaching beneath the marble counter and handing Aelius a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Aelius took it and stepped away from the desk, his hands trembling as he cracked the wax seal. Inside the envelope there was no money. There was no check. Instead, a small, heavy object slid out into his palm. It was a solid silver chess piece. A knight. Along with the piece was a single, handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The penmanship was sharp, elegant, and commanding. You refused to be a pawn, Aelius. You proved to me that some men cannot be bought. The world is full of monsters who believe they are untouchable, but they have a fatal flaw. They underestimate the men who have nothing left to lose. Your daughter is safe. Now let's get justice for your wife. Keep the knight. When I need you to move, I will call. Thoughts. Aelius stared at the silver knight resting in his scarred palm. He wasn't just a hotel worker anymore. He had just been drafted into a billionaire's war, and for the first time in 3 years, Aelius Bell was ready to fight. High above the frantic pulse of downtown Chicago, the executive boardroom of Moore Omnicorp was a theater of silent warfare. The room was a stark expanse of black marble, chrome, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, godlike view of the city. At the head of the impossibly long conference table sat Vida Moore. She wore a tailored crimson blazer that felt less like corporate attire and more like armor. Her face was an unreadable mask, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the man seated directly to her right. William Tressel, the chief operating officer, leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of oily confidence. Tressel was a man who wore his ambition like expensive cologne, overpowering and entirely manufactured. For 3 years, he had been quietly planting seeds of dissent among the board members, leaking fabricated stories to the press about Vida's erratic behavior, and positioning himself as the stable, necessary successor. Today was the day he planned to execute the coup. Vida, Tressel began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy as he addressed the 12 board members present. The media narrative surrounding your leadership has become untenable. The upcoming unauthorized biography paints you as a ruthless sociopath, and our stock is taking a brutal hit. We cannot hemorrhage investors because of your abrasive public image. It is with a heavy heart that I must call for a formal vote of no confidence. A heavy silence descended upon the room. Several board members, those Tressel had already bought or blackmailed, nodded in solemn agreement. Vida didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply picked up a slim silver remote from the table and pressed a single button. The massive smart glass wall behind her darkened, instantly projecting a series of documents in crisp, high-definition resolution. I agree, William. Corporate liability is a serious issue, Vida said smoothly, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. Which is why I find it fascinating that you used company funds to bribe 2 Chicago police detectives exactly 3 years ago. Tressel's confident smile faltered. I have no idea what you're talking about. This is a desperate distraction, Vida. Is it? Vida pressed the remote again. A new image appeared. A bank wire transfer originating from a Moore Omnicorp shell account in the Cayman Islands, routing $300,000 to an offshore account linked to a CPD evidence coordinator. A murmur rippled through the board members. Tressel sat up straight, his face suddenly draining of color. This is fabricated. You are hacking company records to smear me. Vida ignored him, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. She pressed the button a 3rd time. The screen flashed to a high-resolution, time-stamped photograph of a mangled, custom obsidian black Bentley Bentayga sitting in an unregulated salvage yard in Gary, Indiana. Next to it was an affidavit, heavily stamped by a notary. November 14th, 2023, Vida stated, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You were an hour late to the shareholder gala. You claimed you hit a deer. But Lower Wacker Drive doesn't have deer, William. It only has pedestrians. Specifically, a 29-year-old mother named Sarah Bell, whom you left to die on the concrete so you wouldn't miss a cocktail hour. Pandemonium erupted in the boardroom. The board members, previously aligned with Tressel, were now shouting over each other, horrified by the absolute, undeniable proof of a felony cover-up. Tressel sprang to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the marble floor. You bitch, he snarled, the smooth corporate veneer shattering to reveal the desperate cornered animal underneath. You think you can just erase me? I have contingencies. I have files ready to blast to the Wall Street Journal that will tank this company into the ground. If I go down, I am taking you and your entire empire with me. Vida leaned forward, resting her elbows on the black marble table. She looked at him not with anger, but with absolute pity. You misunderstand the situation, William, Vida said softly. I didn't bring this to the board to negotiate. I brought it to the board so they could watch you lose. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. 4 uniformed Chicago police officers, flanked by 2 plainclothes detectives, strode into the room. William Tressel, the lead detective barked over the chaos, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for vehicular manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and corporate fraud. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. As the officers slammed Tressel against the glass wall, reading him his rights, Tressel twisted his head to glare at Vida. The press is already gathered downstairs for the coup, Vida. They'll tear you apart. My dead man's switch just activated. The media will frame this as you framing me to save your own skin. You don't have the public trust to survive this. Vida watched impassively as they hauled him out of the room. She knew he was right about one thing: the media narrative. Tressel had spent months painting her as a monster. The press, currently swarming the lobby of the Moore building, would assume this arrest was just another ruthless, corrupt maneuver by the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley to eliminate a rival. The board was already looking at her with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. She needed a counter-narrative. She needed something real, something that couldn't be bought, fabricated, or spun by crisis management teams. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her platinum smartphone, and dialed a number. Yes? A deep, steady voice answered on the first ring. Aelius, Vida said, looking out at the flashing police lights gathering on the street below. I need my night. 30 minutes later, Aelius Bell stepped out of a black town car and onto the chaotic pavement in front of the Moore Omnicorp headquarters. The scene was a madhouse. News vans lined the streets, satellite dishes extended toward the gray winter sky, and a mob of journalists armed with microphones and flashing cameras surged against a barricade of private security guards. Aelius's heart pounded violently against his ribs. He was wearing his only suit, a cheap navy blue two-piece he had worn to Sarah's funeral. It was slightly too loose on his exhausted frame, but as he reached into his pocket and felt the cold, solid weight of the silver chess piece, his spine stiffened. He wasn't here as a victim. He was here as a father who had just secured his daughter's future, and a husband who was finally getting justice. David Miller, Vida's hulking head of security, met Aelius at the curb. Stay close to me, Mr. Bell. It's a zoo in there. They pushed through the throngs of screaming reporters and entered the sprawling, futuristic lobby of the building. In the center of the atrium, a makeshift press conference had been assembled. Vida Moore stood at a podium, bristling with microphones. She looked incredibly isolated, a solitary figure surrounded by a hostile firing squad of journalists shouting accusations. Ms. Moore, Isn't it true that William Tressel was planning to oust you today? A reporter from the Tribune yelled. Are these criminal charges just a convenient assassination of a corporate rival? Ms. Moore, sources say you orchestrated this arrest to cover up your own financial mismanagement. How do you respond? Vida held up a hand, silencing the room with sheer commanding presence. Then her eyes found Aelius standing at the edge of the crowd. For a fraction of a second, the icy facade cracked, revealing a profound mutual respect. She nodded at him. I will not be answering your questions today, Vida spoke into the microphones, her voice cutting through the cavernous lobby. Because this story isn't about me. It isn't about Moore Omnicorp, and it isn't about corporate power struggles. It is about a man named William Tressel, who believed his wealth made him a god, and the man who proved him wrong. I yield my time to Mr. Aelius Bell. The journalists exchanged confused, frantic glances as Vida stepped back from the podium. Aelius took a deep breath, released it, and walked up the steps. He stood before the microphones, staring out at the sea of flashing bulbs and cynical faces. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands. Then he looked up, his eyes burning with a fierce, undeniable truth. My name is Aelius Bell, he began, his voice slightly raspy but entirely steady. I am not a CEO. I am a night manager at a hotel. 3 years ago, my wife, Sarah, was killed in a hit-and-run on Lower Wacker Drive. The police told me the cameras were broken. They told me there were no leads. They told me to go home and mourn. The lobby fell deathly silent. The aggressive posturing of the press corps vanished, replaced by rapt attention. For 3 years, I have worked double shifts. I have drowned in medical debt trying to keep my 7-year-old daughter alive from a terminal illness, Aelius continued, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Yesterday, Vida Moore offered me $1 million to spend a night in her penthouse, to debase myself, to prove her theory that every person has a price. A shocked gasp rippled through the reporters. Vida stood perfectly still, her face impassive, letting Aelius expose her darkest impulse to the world. She was allowing him to destroy her carefully guarded image. I refused, Aelius said loudly, the strength in his voice commanding the room. I refused because I could not look my sick daughter in the eye if I bought her life with tainted money. I walked away from $1 million. I walked away from a cure. Aelius leaned closer to the microphones, his eyes sweeping across the cameras. And do you know what the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley did in response? She didn't destroy me. She didn't retaliate. Anonymously, she paid off $400,000 of my medical debt. She secured my daughter a place in a life-saving clinical trial, and then she used her immense resources to do the one thing the Chicago Police Department refused to do. He pulled the police file from his coat and slammed it onto the podium. She found the man who killed my wife, William Tressel. Aelius spat the name like poison. He hit her with his car, and he used his millions to bribe the police and crush the evidence. Vida Moore didn't have William Tressel arrested today to save her job. She had him arrested to save my family. She sacrificed her own company's stock. She invited this media circus, all to bring a murderer to justice. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of raw, unvarnished truth. The reporters were no longer looking for a corporate scandal. They were staring at a genuine tragedy that had just been avenged. You want a story about corporate greed? Aelius asked, tears finally brimming in his eyes, not of sorrow, but of vindication. Write about William Tressel. But if you want the truth about Vida Moore, write this. When I was completely out of moves, she gave me back my life. She isn't a monster. She is the only person in this city who actually gave a damn. Aelius stepped away from the podium. The lobby erupted into a deafening roar of overlapping questions, camera flashes blinding the room in a strobe of white light. But Aelius didn't look at the press. He turned to look at Vida. Vida Moore, the woman who had spent her entire life believing the world was inherently corrupt, stood staring at the exhausted hotel worker who had just saved her empire by simply telling the truth. For the first time in her adult life, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across her face. She walked over to him, ignoring the frantic journalists shouting her name. "Checkmate," Vida whispered over the din of the crowd. "Not quite," Aelius replied, a weary but genuine smile touching his own lips. "The knight is still on the board." "Good," she said, her icy eyes softening, "because the game is just getting started." News feeds across the globe erupted within minutes of Aelius's impromptu speech. The footage of the exhausted, grieving hotel manager standing before a sea of ravenous journalists went completely viral, saturating every social media platform and cable news network by nightfall. The media narrative, which William Tressel had so carefully engineered to destroy Vida Moore, violently inverted. Instead of an icy, sociopathic CEO ruthlessly purging a rival, the world saw a fiercely protective leader who had weaponized her billions to tear down a corrupt executive and deliver justice to a shattered family. Wall Street reacted with unprecedented fervor. By the time the opening bell rang the following morning, Moore Omnicorp stock didn't crash. It skyrocketed, shattering all-time highs. Investors weren't running from the controversy. They were clamoring to align with a company led by a woman who commanded absolute loyalty and wielded justice like a broadsword. William Tressel, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The Cook County District Attorney, armed with Vida's irrefutable evidence and Aelius's devastating public testimony, denied bail. The disgraced chief operating officer traded his bespoke Italian suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, confined to an isolated cell in the Metropolitan Correctional Center as federal prosecutors began unearthing a decade of his corporate fraud. Far away from the chaotic media circus and the boardroom wars, the atmosphere inside Lurie Children's Hospital was a quiet, sterile sanctuary. Aelius sat in a plastic chair in the corner of room 412, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his daughter's chest. For the first time in her life, Candice was hooked up to a state-of-the-art intravenous line, administering the experimental Vertex Pharmaceuticals gene therapy. The heavy, terrifying rattle that usually accompanied her breathing was already beginning to soften. A soft knock at the open door broke Aelius's trance. He turned to see Vida standing in the threshold. She looked entirely out of her element. Stripped of her crimson blazers and sharp corporate armor, she wore a simple cashmere sweater, dark slacks, and a beige trench coat draped over her arm. Without her security detail hovering over her shoulder, the billionaire looked strikingly human, almost vulnerable in the fluorescent hospital lighting. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice hushed, lacking its usual commanding edge. Aelius stood, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Of course. She just woke up." Vida stepped into this room, her pale blue eyes fixed on the tiny girl in the hospital bed. Candice looked incredibly small, surrounded by the humming medical equipment, but her eyes were bright and curious. "Candice," Aelius said softly, stepping aside so his daughter had a clear view. "This is Ms. Moore. She's the lady who helped us." Candice tilted her head, studying the striking woman with the unfiltered scrutiny only a 7-year-old could manage. "Are you the fairy godmother?" she asked, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. "Daddy said someone did magic for us. I didn't know fairy godmothers wore black pants." Vida froze, an unfamiliar tightness seizing her throat. She had faced hostile boards, aggressive politicians, and ruthless competitors without batting an eye. But the pure, innocent gratitude of this sick child completely dismantled her defenses. "I'm not a fairy godmother, Candice," Vida replied, taking a hesitant step closer to the bed. She crouched down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Actually, I'm someone who forgot how to be brave for a very long time. Your daddy is the one with the magic. He reminded me how to use it." Candice smiled, a tired but radiant expression that lit up the sterile room. "He is very brave," He fought the monsters for me." "He certainly did," Vida whispered. She reached out, her perfectly manicured hand gently brushing a stray auburn curl from Candice's forehead. A single tear broke free from Vida's eye, tracing a hot path down her cheek. It was a physical manifestation of the ice cracking around her heart. Aelius watched them, overwhelmed by the profound shift in the universe. Just 48 hours ago, this woman had tried to buy his soul to prove the world was a corrupt, hollow place. Now, she was weeping at his daughter's bedside, entirely transformed by the very integrity she had sought to destroy. Their quiet moment was abruptly shattered when David Miller, Vida's chief of security, materialized in the doorway, his face grim. "Ms. Moore, Mr. Bell," David said, his deep voice keeping low so as not to startle the child. "We have a situation downstairs. Tressel's lead defense attorney just cornered me in the lobby. He managed to slip past the press perimeter. He is demanding 5 minutes with Aelius." Aelius's jaw tightened. "What does he want?" "He has a briefcase, Aelius. He claims he has an offer that will end the civil suit and secure your family for generations," David warned. Vida stood up, instantly wiping the tear from her cheek as the familiar, icy resolve hardened in her eyes. "Tell him to go straight to hell, David. Aelius isn't speaking to that snake." "Wait," Aelius interjected, stepping forward. He looked at Vida, his expression entirely calm. "Let him come up." Vida turned to him, alarmed. "Aelius, don't. Tressel is backed into a corner. He is going to offer you an astronomical sum of money to retract your statement and claim I coerced you into that press conference. He wants to introduce reasonable doubt to save himself from a murder conviction." "I know exactly what he wants," Aelius said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his smartphone. He tapped the screen, opening the voice recorder app, and handed the phone to David. "Leave this recording. Let him in. I want everything on the record." 10 minutes later, a slick, sweating man in an expensive gray suit was escorted into a private hospital conference room down the hall. Aelius sat at the end of the long table, the silver knight chess piece resting near his right hand. The lawyer wasted no time. He opened his briefcase and pushed a legally binding contract across the table, followed by a certified bank draft. $50 million, Mr. Bell, the lawyer said, his voice slick with desperate persuasion. "Untaxed, offshore, entirely untraceable. All you have to do is sign this affidavit stating that Vida Moore threatened your job and forced you to lie about the hit and run to ruin William Tressel. You take the money, you disappear to a private island with your daughter, and this all goes away." Aelius didn't even look at the check. He stared directly into the lawyer's panicked eyes. He thought of Sarah's broken body on the pavement. He thought of the 3 years of suffocating terror, the eviction notices, the sound of Candice fighting for her life in a freezing apartment. "Tell William Tressel," Aelius said, his voice dropping to a register so cold it made the lawyer flinch, "that he doesn't have enough money in the world to buy his way out of this cage. And tell him that if he ever sends someone near my family again, I won't wait for the police to finish their job." Aelius stood up, picking up his silver knight, and walked out of the room, leaving the $50 million check sitting on the table. Behind the door, Vida Moore leaned against the wall, having listened to the entire exchange. She looked at Aelius, a profound, unshakable respect radiating from her face. "You really are unbuyable," she breathed. "Like I told you, Ms. Moore," Aelius replied, pocketing his chess piece, "my daughter's hero is not for sale." 6 months later, the brutal Chicago winter had finally surrendered to a vibrant, blooming spring. The ice on Lake Michigan melted into a brilliant, sparkling blue, and the city breathed with a renewed, electric energy. Inside the main courtroom of the Richard J. Daley Center, a judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, signaling the definitive end of an era. William Tressel stood before the bench, stripped of his arrogance and his wealth. He looked hollow, aged 20 years in a matter of months. The judge handed down a sentence of 25 years, without the possibility of parole for vehicular manslaughter, corporate fraud, and witness tampering. As the bailiffs clamped the heavy iron cuffs around Tressel's wrists and dragged him out of the courtroom, Aelius Bell exhaled a breath he realized he had been holding for 3 long years. Justice was not just a concept anymore. It was a reality. Later that afternoon, Aelius walked into a sprawling, sunlit office on the 42nd floor of the Moore Omnicorp Tower. The space was beautiful, decorated in warm oak and soft greens, a stark contrast to the cold black marble of Vida's executive floors above. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the thriving city, was Vida. "You missed the sentencing," Aelius said, tossing his suit jacket onto the leather sofa. "I didn't need to be there," Vida replied, turning around with a warm, easy smile. "I knew the outcome. Besides, I had finalizing to do." She walked over to the large oak desk in the center of the room and patted a thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished wood. "The board approved it unanimously this morning," Vida said, her eyes shining with genuine excitement. "Moore Omnicorp is officially spinning off a philanthropic wing. It will operate entirely independent of the tech conglomerate, funded with an initial endowment of $500 million from my personal estate." Aelius walked closer, looking at the embossed title on the top folder. "The Sarah Bell Foundation for Medical Equity and Corporate Accountability." "Vida," Aelius breathed, overwhelmed. This is massive. You're going to change thousands of lives." "No," Vida corrected, stepping around the desk to stand directly in front of him. "You are going to change thousands of lives." Aelius blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I am a CEO, Aelius. I know how to build software, how to crush competitors, and how to read market trends. I spent my entire life believing that people were just assets waiting to be bought. You proved me wrong, but that doesn't mean I suddenly possess the moral compass required to run this foundation." She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a rarity for the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley. "I need someone who understands what it means to be desperate, but refuses to compromise their integrity," Vida continued, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I need someone who knows the true cost of medical debt and the devastating impact of corporate greed on the working class. I need you to run this foundation, Aelius. Not as my employee, but as the director." Aelius stared at her, the weight of the offer settling over him. He wasn't just a hotel night manager anymore. He wasn't just a grieving widower or a desperate father. He was a man who had faced down billionaires, rejected unimaginable wealth, and forged a completely new destiny for his family through sheer, unbending honor. "What about Candice?" Aelius asked, his voice thick with emotion. "The Foundation's charter includes full, on-site medical accommodations and flexible remote hours for the director," Vida said smoothly, her business acumen finally aligning with her newly discovered humanity. "Her gene therapy is progressing beautifully. Her doctors say she will be able to attend a normal second-grade classroom by the fall. I want you both to have the life you deserve." Aelius looked around the beautiful office, the sunlight catching the embossed letters of his late wife's name on the legal documents. He thought of Sarah, and how proud she would be. He thought of Candice, who was currently at their new home in Oak Park, playing in a sunny backyard without a single oxygen tube holding her back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, solid silver knight. He walked over to the expansive oak desk and gently placed the chess piece right in the center, a symbol of their incredible, unorthodox alliance. "I accept," Aelius said, turning back to Vida with a bright, unshakable smile. "Where do we start?" Vida Moore looked at the silver knight, then up at the man who had completely redefined her world. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at a subordinate, an enemy, or a commodity. She was looking at an equal. "We start," Vida said, her voice ringing with newfound purpose, by saving everyone else. If Aelius's incredible journey of integrity and Vida's powerful redemption touched your heart, please like this video and share it with anyone who needs to remember that true honor can never be bought. In a world full of compromises, be like Aelius. Subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, real-life stories of justice, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with the $50 million offer? We love hearing your thoughts.